morning. My name is Mike Adone.
And I'm Trevor Doringer.
And I'm Joseph Baldwin. And we will be performing President Truman versus General MacArthur. Struggle for command. Preserving the power of the presidency. Good morning. My name is General Joseph Lawton Collins. I served as Chief of Staff in the Army in President Truman's administration from 1949 to 1953. At this time, the United States was developing its strategy against communism in the nuclear age. In 1949, this threat dramatically increased when the Soviet Union successfully developed and tested an atomic bomb, ending the United States' monopoly on these weapons. And the Chinese communists forced Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists to flee to the island of Formosa. Shortly after the power shift, on June 25, 1950, Communist North Korea successfully invaded democratic South Korea, throwing the Truman administration into a frenzy. Shortly after the attack, President Truman appointed General MacArthur Supreme Commander of the U.S.-led UN forces sent to defend the South Koreans. I found myself in the middle of a battle of wills between these two stubborn men.
Although Truman was elected by the people, I fear that he is too soft-spoken and slow to understanding military tactics to be a successful commander-in-chief. I don't know that I'm willing to put my trust in.
I have the greatest respect for General MacArthur as a soldier, but I don't like his controlling personality and lack of discipline. Time and time again, he shows an unwillingness to follow the orders of my administration.
To win the war in Korea, we must meet our opposition in Asia with maximum counterforce. Communism in Asia must be defeated before we can move on to Europe. Therefore, we must call on Chiang Kai-shek's military forces on Formosa to aid us in our effort against communism.
Europe is the front to the Cold War. We must prevent communism from spreading through Europe. Then we can focus on Asia. MacArthur's plan to use Chiang Kai-shek's unreliable forces from Formosa would only expand the war and may force Red China to enter.
This war must be fought head-on. We must show our strength and not back down. Even if China enters, I'm confident that our men can defeat communism. There is no substitute for victory.
We will use a limited war strategy in Korea for these vital reasons. First, to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted. Second, to make sure that the security of this nation and the rest of the world is not jeopardized. And finally, to prevent a third world war.
Shortly after the beginning of the war in June, the UN troops were surrounded by the North Korean troops at Busan until General MacArthur's daring invasion of Incheon that pushed the communist forces back in September. General Omar Bradley, in his own words, stated, "Incheon proved to be the luckiest military operation in history. The swiftness and the magnitude of the victory were mind-boggling." President Truman was pleased with MacArthur's success in the Koreas, but was skeptical of his willingness to follow orders and issued a face-to-face meeting on October 15, 1950 at Wake Island.
Mind if I smoke, Mr. President?
No, I suppose I've had more smoke blown in my face than any other man alive. Now, General, in these private meetings, I would like to be sure that we are in agreement regarding the war policy in Korea. Firstly, what are the chances of Chinese or Soviet interference?
Very little. Had they interfered in these first or second months, it would have been decisive, but we are no longer fearful of their intervention.
General, I did not ask if you were afraid. I want to know, do you believe that the Chinese will cross the Yalu River and enter the war?
No, I do not. But if you'll forgive me, sir, I do not understand why we decide to crawl before the communists. They can't do anything militarily. They would be afraid of massive retaliation.
And so am I. Now let's cut right to it, General. I expect you to make sure that there are no more pilot errors 60 miles into Soviet territory.
If I may say so, sir, I believe that an alternative policy would be ideal to exploit the weakness of the communists.
General, do you understand and do you accept the U.S. military strategy in Korea?
Yes, sir, of course. If it's all right, I need to get back to Japan as soon as possible and would like to leave before luncheon if that's convenient.
Yes, I believe this covers the main topic. I am satisfied that we are in complete agreement.
Mr. President,
At ease, General.
we received an urgent letter from General MacArthur.
Read it to me, General.
November 25th, 1950, the Chinese military forces are committed to North Korea in great and ever-increasing strength. We face an entirely new war. We must pass on to the defensive.
MacArthur assured me at Wake Island that the Chinese would not enter the war and that U.S. troops would be headed home by Christmas. This is unacceptable.
Yes, sir, I agree. This is the very thing that we've been trying so hard to prevent. This not only extends the war, it expands it as well. Now, General MacArthur is asking the Joint Chiefs for permission to bomb these two bridges crossing over the Yalu River.
Send a letter to MacArthur. Tell him that the bombing of the Yalu bridges would secure forces under his command, but the Chinese and the Russians might construe it as an attack on Manchuria, endangering our forces and expanding the war.
We sent a letter and agreed that the destruction of the bridges crossing over the Yalu River would ensure the security of MacArthur's forces, but we limited and restricted MacArthur's control. Then on December 6, 1950, we issued a gag order on the general, eliminating his public voice on foreign affairs. MacArthur was furious, and he made it known. On the 20th of March, 1951, General MacArthur sent a letter to Congressman Joseph Martin.
Congressman Martin, my views and recommendations with respect to the situation created by Red China's entry into the war against us in Korea have been submitted to Washington in most complete detail. These views follow the conventional pattern of meeting force with maximum counterforce. Your view, with respect to the utilization of Chinese forces on Formosa, is in conflict with neither logic nor this tradition.
It seems strangely difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest. If we win the war to communism in Asia, Europe most probably would avoid war and yet preserve freedom. There is no substitute for victory. There is a substitute. We must win this war through peaceful negotiations, not through expansion. MacArthur should have been relieved long ago. I knew when he submitted his four-step plan for victory that he wanted to enforce his own policies and expand the war. But this letter, this is it. MacArthur must be fired.
President Truman asked me to send an order to General MacArthur on April 11, 1951, relieving him of his military commands. Then later that day, the President informed the American people of the firing through a televised statement, just after MacArthur had received the memo.
Gene, we're going home. My return to the United States was met by overwhelming support. Arriving at San Francisco's airport on April 17, 1951, I was met by 10,000 people who greeted me as a hero. As I returned to New York, I was met by 7.5 million Americans who held one of the largest ticker tape parades in history. On May 3rd, I testified at the Senate hearings that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were in full support of my military strategy in Korea, and that my way, destruction of the Communist Empire, was the only way the United States could win the Cold War.
The Senate hearings were closed, with authorized transcripts edited for security reasons released hourly by the press. I and the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified. General Omar Bradley insisted that if we followed MacArthur's plan for victory, that it would be the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. A great turning point came when we refuted MacArthur's claim that we supported his strategy. We maintained that the dismissal of MacArthur was a necessity.
The reaction to the relief of General MacArthur was overwhelmingly negative. The Chicago Tribune editorial called for my impeachment, charging that I was mentally and morally unfit for this office. A Gallup poll revealed that 69% disapproved of my decision. But the stand I took against MacArthur was among the most important of my presidency. I paid a heavy price as it ended my political career. But the security of this nation is far more important than myself. I knew I had made the right decision. And in the long run, the American people would come to understand that a limited war in Korea prevented a nuclear war.
6 decades later, we see that the stand that President Truman took in firing General MacArthur led to a peaceful conclusion to a contained war in Korea. Today, relations with China have improved, but North Korea is becoming an increasing military threat.
6 decades later, the principle of civilian control of the military, challenged as never before in our nation's history, stands stronger than ever. President Truman preserved the constitutional power and authority of our president.
6 decades later, the threat of a nuclear war still exists. The question we must ask: have the people of the United States and of the world learned from Truman's stand? Will today's leaders, when confronted with the threat of a nuclear war, continue to follow the policies of peaceful negotiations? Thank you.